Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars.
Hayi ngiyabonga Golide, salibonani bogodlwayo abahle. Ngiyabonga ukuthi linginikeza ithuba lokuthi sike sixoxe kancane ngalindaba. Indaba ebuhlungu kakhulu, kodwa kuqhakathekile kakhulu ukuthi siyikhulume, ibe indaba elulwa yithi thina abanikazi bayo. Bathi isilonda siziwa ngumnikazi. Ngizama ukuthi ngiphendule. Icala ele-genocide is one of 3 international crimes. Ngizachaza ukuthi ama-international crimes kudingakalani ukuthi icala libe international crime. Kuyini okwehlukanisa i-normal crime or a domestic crime from an international crime. Njalo ama-requirements awe-international crime yiwaphi, into eyenza ukuthi kube yi-international crime. I-genocide is one of 3 international crimes. Kahle there are 4 according to international law, but the latest one, which is the crime of aggression, yesiyibone isithonisiswa lapha eRussia. Ama-international crime amathathu okuthiwa ngama-core international crimes agoqela i-genocide yona ngokwayo. Ngizayichaza ukuthi yini i-genocide, bese kusiba le crimes against humanity, i-international crime yesibili le. Ngizayichaza leyo nxa sithola ithuba ukuthi siyikhulume, kumbe singayifakela isikhathi sayo, ngoba wonke lama international crime ukuthi umuntu awelule kudinga isikhathi, ngamacala asindayo njalo kudinga isikhathi. I-international crime esithathu ile abayibiza ngama-war crimes. Ngithemba liwazwile ekhulunywa eGaza. Ngingakangeni ku-genocide, ngizathi ngamafitshane ngizame ukuthi ngichasise ukuthi okwehlukanisa a normal crime, a domestic crime and an international crime kungayini. Maningi amacala ayetheswa abantu emazweni ahlukeneyo. Singathi nje ukubulala umuntu emazweni amaningi kulicala, ukudlwengula umuntu emazweni amaningi kulicala, abasebenza i-rape. Ukubamba umuntu inkunzi emazweni amaningi kulicala, yesibizwa i-robbery. Ukulimaza umuntu emazweni amaningi kubizwa nge-assault, kumbe ngamazwe ama-French, kumbe ngamazwe ama-English, kumbe yini, kumbe i-West Africa, East Africa. So yonke into elokulimaza umuntu, lokulimaza impahla yomuntu esikhathini esiningi emazweni amaningi balicala, okwenza ukuthi icala likhwele ezingeni lize libe yi-international crime. Kugoqela indlela icala lakhona lidalwe ngayo okokuqala, bese kugoqela isisindo secala leli laso siyaliphakamisa leli cala libe yi-international crime. Okwesithathu, ngabantu abayibo abadala leli cala. Kuqhakathekile ukuthi bekhangelisiswe, yikho okuhlukanisa ukuthi umuntu lodala icala elinje icala leli lingaba yi-normal crime kumbe lingaba yi-international crime. Ngesilungu, ngingazama ukubela ngesilungu ukuze kube lula, kule into lezi ezintathu kuthiwa yi-gravity of the crime. Gravity, how serious is this crime? The second bit is the scale. What is the size? What is the size of the crime? How scaled is it? Ubulela abantu abangu-5 endaweni eyodwa kumbe ubulela abantu abangu-thousands. Iscale le. I-gravity yisisindo ukuthi icala lakhona belingakanani icala ukusinda. Ushaya umuntu ngempama kumbe ubulela abantu, wachisa abantu, warepa abantu, wenzani? How grave is the crime? And then ama-perpetrators, ngithe i-level of perpetration ukuthi ngabantu abanjani okunye okwenza icala libe international crime is the level and the organization of perpetrators. Usually if it is a government or a party or a rebel movement, it is highly organized people and they are committing this crime as part of a policy that elevates it to an international crime. And umahluko nje kuphela ukuthi into nxa international crime, it becomes the responsibility of the international community to prosecute, investigate, prosecute and punish that crime. Hayi ngiyakuzwa Golide, ngizananabula. Asiqale ngokuthi sengichazile laphana ukuthi umahluko between a domestic crime, which is a normal crime, and an international crime yikuyini. What raises a crime to the level of interest of the international community? Siye ku-genocide, singathola ithuba singananabula nge-crimes against humanity ngoba likhona elinye iphepha engalibhalayo ngizalishare le group, lizaphuma nje manje liyapublishwa yi-South African yearbook on international law elichaza ukuthi Gukurahundi yayi-crime against humanity. Kuyavuma ukuthi icala libe yi-genocide, liphinde libe yi-crimes against humanity, liphinde libe yi-war crime. Kuyavuma. Nxa ama-requirements wonke satisfied kuyavuma. Asiye ku-genocide. I-genocide ayiqalanga eMatebeleland ukuthi ibe committed. I-genocide is as old as humanity. As soon as men knew how to kill each other, they have been committing genocide. Some of the most known genocides is the Herero genocide. Alifondi history leyazi amaJelimani afike eNamibia aqeda amaHerero lamaVambo babaqeda nje. That's how they occupied Namibia, by killing, massacring the Herero people in mass. That was a genocide. That was 1905. So kusiza i-genocide eyaba khona e-Armenia, ama-Turkish eqeda ama-Armenian. Yenye i-genocide eyaba khona leyo yayo-1915. Enye i-genocide eyazakalayo ememetheke eyazakala kakhulu leyo esiyazi kakhulu eyamaJuda eyabo-1943 eka-Hitler eqeda amaJuda ebulala amaJuda yaba i-genocide le lapho wabhuqa amaJuda afika 6 million. Akuzange kume lapho kwasokusithi emveni after about 50 years or so kwaqhamuka impi le yayiseBosnia, former Yugoslavia, leyazi le yadabula isizwe lesasasi former Yugoslavia phakathi kwaba le genocide yadalwayo futhi khona pha. Base bethonisisa so kuvulwe icourt tribunal eYugoslavia khona ngale yathonisisa i-genocide. Ngaleso sikhathi same time kwaba le genocide eyamatutsi eRwanda, sayibona sonke bebaphosela emfuleni lapha Lake Victoria. Kodwa emveni kweRwanda kwakube le genocide eMatebeleland. I-genocide ukuze ibe yi-genocide, leli gama elithi genocide lidalwa ngokuhlanganisa amagama amabili. Genos means race or tribe, and then uside means killing. Yiko kuthiwa homicide. Homicide yikubulala umuntu, a human being, a homo sapien. Femicide yikubulala umuntu ongumama, a female. I-genocide yona, genos is a Greek word meaning race or tribe, and then uside is a Latin word meaning killing. So i-genocide imemetheke yaqhaqha kakhulu after 1948. So after 1948 emveni kokubhuqwa amaJuda ngama-Nazi, into eyenzakala laphana ukuthi kulo mJuda okuthiwa nguLemkin, uRaphael Lemkin, nguye owabumba leli baleli genocide. Nguye owakhokhela ukubhala i-first convention okuthiwa i-genocide convention eka 1948 yabhalwa iconvention le emveni kokuthi genocide isidalwe ngama-Nazi. Yayingekho, lalingasilocala under international law before the Nazi Holocaust. But the crime of genocide was created in the convention, the Genocide Convention, which was crafted by uLemkin. uLemkin was a legal scholar and a genocide scholar, nguye owabumba leli bala, and lahle lamemetheka lemukeleka iNuremberg, inkantolo yiye yathonisisa amaJuda, yalemukela ukuthi licala elidaliweyo ukubhuqa amaJuda kusenziwa ngama-Nazi. eNuremberg icala leli le-genocide lagoqela yonke into eyayisenzakala, ukudlwengulwa kwabomama, ukubulala, ukuhlukumeza abantu abakubiza torture, kodwa lalingakeluleki okuzwayo ukuze libe licala sibili elicacayo, lacaciswa ngamacala ayenzakala later 50 years later eYugoslavia laseRwanda. Ngizachaza yona igenocide singathi idefinwa kanjani. I-Genocide Convention eyiyo esingathi is the authoritative convention or treaty that defines genocide. It defines Article 2 convention. Genocide, any of the following acts. The genocide is defined as follows: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So, the intention must be to destroy in whole or in part any of the four following groups. It must be any of the four: national, ethnic, racial, or religious. The following acts: killing members of that group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Ngizachaza. Ngiyabonga. Hayi ngizaphendula, ngizazama ukuthi ngiphendule imibuzo. Bengizama ukuthi ngeluli kwenzela ukuthi nxa sesixoxa sengani sengiyibeke nje ngayibeka bhadla. So i-genocide ngamafitshane ilama elements amathathu. Icala le-genocide. I-element yokuqala yi-group. Angithi liyakhumbula ngisitsho sithi ama-group kumele be ayi-4. Kule element ye-group, the victim must be part of a protected group, which is national, ethnic, racial, and religious. Political is not part of it. It's very important the distinction layer politically, because kuzangena indaba zezaphu ngokungamasupporters ababulawayo ngokungasomandebele. This is very important. I addressed this for those of you who read the paper. I shared the paper some weeks ago, and if you read it, you will see the distinction and how I deal with the political element of ZAPU supporters. They were Ndebele supporters of ZAPU, and I explained that in that paper. But if first you take 3 distinguishing elements as a genocide. Yokuqala is a protected group. The victim must belong to a protected group. So you must be part of a national group, or part of an ethnic group, or part of a racial group, or part of a religious group. That's the first element. The second element of genocide, the crime, is that there has to be an intent on the part of the perpetrator to destroy the group in whole or in part. For it to be genocide, you cannot have genocide if there is no intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. You don't have to destroy everybody, you don't have to kill everybody, you don't have to kill many thousands, but you must intend to kill them. And you must take steps and actions that demonstrate that intention, that actualize that intention. That's the second element. The third element of genocide is that the specific acts that you commit, that enumerate, the enumerated acts must be part of the genocide. So you must kill people. You must cause serious bodily harm. You must deliberately inflict conditions that are calculated to bring about the destruction of that group. You must impose measures intended to prevent births. You must forcibly transfer children. You don't have to do all of those things. You need to do some of those things. Asizameni ke ukuthi sixoxe ke ngeyokuqala i-element, i-protected group, where the people of Matabeleland part of a protected group as envisaged by the Genocide Convention. Angithi ngithe mina, the victim has to belong to a protected group, and the group must be national, ethnic, racial, and religious. Where people, the victims in Matabeleland, which is people of Matabeleland, which is Ndebeles, because the people that were targeted by Gukurahundi were Ndebeles, because the people living in Matabeleland at the time were Ndebeles. Were they, or do they meet the requirements of a protected group, a protected membership, one of the four? Are they a national group? Are they an ethnic group? Are they a racial group? Are they a religious group? We can eliminate. They are definitely not a religious group. They are definitely not a national group. They are definitely not a racial group. Are they an ethnic group? Right. Sixoxeni kancane ngendaba yokuthi do the Ndebeles meet the requirements of the ethnic protected group? It is very clear. There is nobody who will ever argue whether the characterization was a construct of the post-colonial Rhodesian state. Nobody will ever argue about the clear definitional difference between what they call the Shona and the Ndebele. There were subsects, other ethnic groups within those groups, but broadly speaking, even the naming of the provinces is indicative of this ethnic characterization of Abantu Bematabeleland, who were Ndebeles, which broadly encompassed broader group including Amasutu, Amakalanga. We can debate about whether Kalangas are Ndebele or not, but the reality is, come colonialism or colonization, there was this clear divide between what was Mashonaland, which is Shona groups, Amakorekore, Amandau, the collective of Shona groups. So there is no question, if you look at even historical texts, we can go, I'm trying to find my discussion of the groups. If you look at, for example, literature, whether ngabo Kacheni, we can start there. Okacheni have written about the Ndebele, Beach, Terence Ranger. If you look at all the scholars in Zimbabwe and outside, they have always written about, in various disciplines, they recognize the Ndebele ethnic group in their work. Ukacheni provides authoritative account of the Ndebele as an ethnic group. He separately examines the nation-building project in the context of the challenges of Ndebele particularism in the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras. Ustole does the same, exploring the role of ethnicity and factionalism in Zimbabwe nationalist politics, recognizing the difference between Shona and Ndebele. Terence Ranger traces the evolution of tribalism in Zimbabwe, recognizing that there was a clear distinction between Ndebele and Shona. In his edited volume, Veil assembles compelling scholars on ethnicity in Zimbabwe who trace the evolution of ethnic tensions and violence, recognizing the distinction between Ndebele and Shona and subsects of those tribes. Umoyo has examined the evolution of ethnic tensions, the legal and political concerns of the Ndebele ethnic minority in post-colonial Zimbabwe. Msindo as well. It's all in my paper. I trace all the scholars going back in history. Omembe Shora examines the relationship between ethnicity and political development. Muzondija and Ndlovu Kacheni. So the scholars that I have highlighted cut across all the different ethnic groups. Terence Ranger, Alexander, and Joanne McGregor examine ethnic violence between the Zimbabwe government and the Ndebele in their book, 100 Years in the Forest. And of course, Undlovu, Ukacheni, Usabelo, Umfoetu, discusses the regional perceptions of civil-military relations in Matabeleland. So there is absolutely no question, no doubt, there is recognition, including scholarly recognition, that the Ndebele as an ethnic group are distinct from other ethnic groups in Zimbabwe. Asikakhulumi language, because there is a Ndebele language which was spoken from Victoria Falls all the way across Matabeleland, Usiebite Bridge. And this is not to negate that there is Venda and there is Tonga, but there is, we're not talking about the politicization of language, but there is Ndebele language, which is why even at school, people are taught Ndebele language. There's A-level Ndebele, O-level Ndebele, primary school Ndebele, just like there's O-level Shona. I know that subsequently, after 2013, there's now 16 languages in the country, but we're talking here about Ndebele as an ethnic group. So the Ndebeles are distinguishable as an ethnic group by virtue of their language. They are also distinguishable by virtue of the historical evolution of the pre-colonial Ndebele nation that was violently dismantled by the early colonial settlers. That is why Lopengula's kingdom became a target of dismantling and destruction, because it embodied a Ndebele nation and a Ndebele group, which, mind you, encapsulated many different groups. KulaMaxhosa, kulamaTswana amanye ayethethe endleleni, kulaMasuthu, kulamaKaranga, but it was a Ndebele nation. They are also distinguishable by the geographic location, historically occupying the southwestern Zimbabwean province, aptly called Matabeleland, and parts of Midlands. I've already talked about the distinction of the Ndebeles by their language and their culture, which is derived from the Zulu language and culture, but which has adapted over time. We must never forget that the culture and the language has adapted over time as it has come into confrontation with other cultures. It has adapted, and cultures have been merged and so on. So the objective test for a protected group has been set out in the case, a Rwanda case, a genocide. When they tried to Akayesu, he was the mayor of Akayesu, and they looked at the objective test of what a protected group is, and this test set out in Akayesu meets the requirements of what we see as in Matabeleland for the Ndebeles. There is overwhelming evidence that even at the highest level of political and military authorities as Zimbabwe, Gukurahundi, and even prior, the highest level of political and military authorities perceived Ndebeles or the victims in Matabeleland as belonging to a distinct ethnic group that they targeted for elimination. I try to highlight many examples of that. Asiqaleni thina ngo-1980 ngokayi singakafiki u-1982 iGukurahundi ifika. And this is addressed by Udoran in his book, where he talks about Minister of Justice Uzopo just after the election in 1980. This is where the perpetrator identification of the victim became quite apparent even way before the Gukurahundi was unleashed on the people of Matabeleland on Ndebeles in 1982-83. Uzopho ama-results ade sephumile aka-1980 bawakhangela ama-results lawana bathola ukuthi iMatabeleland le-Midlands had voted overwhelmingly for ZAPU. And this is where sometimes the confusion arises. It was political. No. They realized ukuthi iMatabeleland had voted overwhelmingly for ZAPU. You will remember ZAPU got 20 seats. And there were 20 reserve seats for the whites, and then ZANU had told about 60. UNC had told 3, if you remember. Umzoreo. Lendonga and India told number 1. Uzopho, after that election, said, while some whites were afflicted by withdrawal from power syndrome, on the other side of the coin, some Ndebele Zimbabweans viewed Mugabe's victory as an unbearable power denial which had somehow to be reversed. This is 1980. You can even begin to see this clear perpetrator identification of all the people in Matabeleland. Ngoba iMatabeleland yonke overwhelmingly ZAPU won it. So you can begin to see at the highest level senior government officials characterizing, conflating succinctly the historic and demographic dimension of Ndebeles, calling all the people in Matabeleland Ndebeles, which made this clearly ethnic. It is not just the journalists that captured the ethnic character of these attacks on the Ndebele people. The South African mission at the time drew the same conclusion and said to the government, it seems that the government has decided to hold the Ndebele as a nation responsible for the dissident problem and act mercilessly against them. Secretary of State of the United States at the time, George Shultz, wrote several reports of atrocities being perpetrated by an all-Shona brigade, including indiscriminate killings, torture, rape, beatings, and the destruction of property, including several entire villages. We can even go further. A U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Chester Crocker, he is quite famous. I think he was actually Blacko Crocker, wrote to the U.S. delegation visiting Zimbabwe, describing Mugabe's policy in Matabeleland as turning the 5th Brigade loose on the Ndebele. There was absolutely no debate about the stigmatization of the people of Matabeleland as a separate ethnic group. And as if he wanted to confirm it himself. You remember Mugabe, after he had been removed in a coup, as a blue roof lapana, as a hlezi. Bambuza, I think it was SAPC, ukuthi kathi Gukurahundi ke, what he, if you remember his words, he confirmed the ethnic nature of the Gukurahundi. That was said, it was unfortunate, but that Ndebele party wanted to take power. There is no better acknowledgement than from the mouth of the architect, the chief architect of the Gukurahundi, ukuthi he unleashed the Gukurahundi against what he perceived as Ndebele supporters of ZAPU. That is not to say they may not have killed 1 or 2 Shona supporters of ZAPU, but we are yet to see them, because even Emakaya, when the Gukurahundi arrived, if you spoke Shona, they would spare you. If they stopped a bus and looked at the IDs, anyone with an ID, a name that was not Ndebele, was spared. And the people with Ndebele names were beaten, killed, or disappeared. There is no debate, no doubt, no question that the targeting was ethnic, and that the perception of the perpetrators and the intention of the perpetrators was to target only Ndebele supporters of ZAPU, or what they believed were Ndebeles, who they believed supported dissidents. And they conflated and believed that every Ndebele supported dissident because they were Ndebele. Asikakhulumi ngamanye ama-elements ama-perpetrator where they talked about history, we are revenging for history. You took your grandparents took our wives, our grandmothers, and so on. We're not talking even about that, but we're talking here about the connection between ZAPU and the Ndebeles in that instance. Ukuthi ngigqibe lindaba ethnicity ngizayigqiba ngestatement sekaNkomo 1985. As the election was approaching, uNkomo says ukumgabe, this was in parliament, wathi kuye, you Mugabe, support what the 5th Brigade has done and continue to do in Matabeleland, and that with the 1985 election approaching, some believe that you are doing this not just for electoral advantage, but that your aim is genocide. So I hope that covers the perpetrator perception of the Ndebeles as an ethnic group. Ngizathi ngamafitshane ngizame ukuthi ngithi fahla ngama perceptions ama victims. So the victim perceptions of belonging to the Ndebele ethnic group, which is the self-identification. There is absolutely no doubt, no question, no debate. Ukuthi many of the victims and survivors of the Gukurahundi have reported ukuthi the atrocities were connected to an ethnic narrative and agenda. Ukuthi bathi befika laba bantu, they would target them on the basis of their ethnic identity, and that the perpetrators made no secret of this underlying motive. The victims talk about perpetrators referring to their Shona supremacy. All victims report in all instances that villagers would be forcibly collected and gathered and addressed in the Shona language, not always, but sometimes through an interpreter. And they would be forced to sing songs in Shona all night, and they would be beaten if they failed to do so, because they didn't understand and know the language. Villagers also talk about how if they were unable to understand or respond to Shona questions or questions in the Shona language, they would be targeted for killing and severe beatings. In all instances where a targeted victim was able to speak Shona, they were spared and told to go home. And there are many instances where victims or witnesses attest to this. There is absolutely no question that victims perceive the attacks on themselves as having emanated from the fact that they were targeted as Ndebeles. The Ndebeles saw themselves as victims on account of their ethnicity, and therefore that test, the self-identification test, is met. Both the objective and the subjective test is met. According to the law and the jurisprudence and the cases, establishing genocidal intent is especially difficult. It is not an easy thing because you remember a special intent is attached to the perpetrator. So you must show that the perpetrator in their mind intended to destroy in whole or in part the group. So how do you get into the mind of the perpetrator? Usually it's not possible, right? Because the perpetrator can say, no, I didn't intend to do that. Genocide. But the law is not so foolish. The law cannot accept a perpetrator saying simply, I didn't intend to commit genocide, when in fact we can conclude from a whole range of factors and evidence that you intended to do so. So genocidal intent can be inferred from a range of circumstances, and these circumstances include the context of the perpetration of the crimes against the same group. So if somebody commits crimes repeatedly against the same group on a large scale, we can conclude and infer that you intend to kill and destroy that group. Even if you say you don't, we can infer from your actions that's what you intended. We can also infer genocidal intent from the methodical planning of crimes. If you sit down and you plan crimes like they did, they sent out the Gukurahundi, the 5th Brigade, they trained it from 1980, umgabe wahambe eKorea, wayakhuluma lama-Koreans, ama-North Koreans abuya, bayitrain ibrigade liyana, enyanga le, yabuya, bayi-equipa, bayi-deploya for 4 years, isemathebelele ndibulala abantu. Bayinika equipment, bayinika yonke into, bayi-supplier from one brigade, laphana eBredi. You can conclude from that methodical planning, deploy police intelligence, deploy CIO emathebelele, ukuthi there was an intention. The methodical planning is indicative. You can infer genocidal intention from planning. You can also infer genocidal intention or intent from a demonstration of purposeful actions. Ukuthi kona how they systematically went through from village to village, emathebelele, going in Cholocho, every village. And the systematic collection of people from across Matabeleland, even outside Matabeleland, and bringing them to Palakwe. You can see that this is very purposeful. You can also infer genocidal intent from the scale of atrocities, the scale across the entire region, a curfew across the whole of Matabeleland, starvation, a blockade of food. You can look at the numbers, the scale, 20,000 or even more people killed. You can infer genocidal intent from the words and actions of the perpetrators. What were they saying? I've already talked about what some of the perpetrators would say to victims. You can also infer genocidal intention or intent from the number of victims. You can infer it from the repetitive commission of offenses by the same perpetrators against the same victims, or the same perpetrators against different victims. You can also infer genocidal intent by looking at the deliberate and systematic targeting of members of a group and the exclusion of other groups. I already talked about this, how people would be offloaded from buses, and if your ID showed that your name was Shona, you would be spared. And if your ID was Ndebele, you'd be beaten, killed, or you'd be disappeared. You can also infer genocidal intent from the type of weapons used by the perpetrators. You can also infer genocidal intent from the extent of injuries, the use of the language, derogatory language targeted at members of the group. The list is not exhaustive. There are many other indicative factors that show genocidal intent. But we can see everything that I've highlighted here, if you recall and reflect, that the genocidal intent of the Gukurahundi perpetrators is completely undeniable based on the factors that I have highlighted. There is compelling evidence from victims, from perpetrators themselves, from witnesses, from analysts, from media, reporters, diplomats, and scholars, ukuthi there was clear genocidal intent. Sengiza kuya ku-third requirement, which is the Enumerated Genocidal Acts. You will recall ekuqaleni ngithe besithe kule protected group angithi sathi kule requirement yesibili, which is the genocidal intent, eyiyo esanda kuyikhuluma. Angeke nginanabule ngoba isikhathi sesingani sesidliwe ngumangoye. But sengithe fahla ukuthi likubone nje ukuthi hayi genocidal siyayibona genocidal intent ngezenzo la ngenkulumo la ngokunye nje kwakusenzakala khonapho. Sengizamile ukuthi nguchaze. Okwesithathu, i-requirement esithathu sithe thina ukuthi into beyi-genocide kumele ukuthi kube lama enumerated genocidal acts ngwaqambile. Ngithe is killing members of a group, ukubulala, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. You don't have to destroy the whole. It could be part of the group. Imposing measures intended to prevent births, ukuzalwa kwabantwana within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Amajuda akwenza kakhulu lokho. yikho abakuchaje uPutin khona ukuthi wahamba wathatha abantwana eUkraine wabase Russia iICC. So we need to understand now and discuss whether these enumerated acts are these requirements of these enumerated acts met by the conduct of the Gukurahundi. There is absolutely no question ukuthi iGukurahundi killed singaqala ngekilling ngenzela ukuthi ngithi gagaga ukwenzela ukuthi sichiye isikhathi sembuzo. Ngiyabona sokuhlwile ebakwethu kusuke kwaba isikhathi sakhona saba side kakhulu. So asiye ku killing members of the group. Lokho akubuzwa ngeGukurahundi. It's established very easily. I case eRwanda eka Akayesu yathi yona yaqhuma ukuthi killing is homicide, which is ukubulala umuntu, committed with intent to cause death, which is exactly what happened eMathebeleland. There is very little controversy ukuthi Gukurahundi committed acts of killing against members of the Ndebele ethnic group. Manengi ama instances siqale esiwale babulala abantu abangu 52, esiwale babulala 55, esilwane babulala 52, emkhonyeni babulala 22, esalankomo babulala 12, esolobhoni babulala 14, ekorodzi babulala 5, enxuma babulala 10, ebhumbu babulala 4, esandawana babulala 3, embiriya. Wherever you look babulala abantu en mass, in large numbers. And lapho sikhuluma ngabantu abaqanjwayo ababonakalayo baningi abantu abathathwayo bayabulawa, abanye babethathwa bebulawa bejikela emgodini eBhalagwa, abanye begqitshelwa khona abagqitshele khona, abanye abazakali ukuthi bayanga. So ukubulala abantu, killing members of the group, is readily and very easily established. We don't even want to spend too much time about it. The numbers we can debate, but there were tens of thousands of people that were killed. The second enumerated act is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Laleyilayo ngubani ongayiphikisa? Abantu babechaywa, bexathulwa, bethelwa ngeplastiki echisayo, behlatshwa ngengqamu, begwazwa, bedlwengulwa, besenzwa yonke into bechaphazwa ngazo zonke indlela. So there is absolutely no question ukuthi the actions of the Gukurahundi cause serious bodily and mental harm to members of the Ndebele group. We can look at so many instances from rape, sexual violence, which are considered as the worst forms of causing serious bodily harm. There were thousands of rapes. Case Rwanda Akayesu actually recognized the systematic rape of Tutsi women in 1994 as a strategy aimed at the destruction of the Tutsi group by destroying their spirit, their will to live, and their will to procreate, which is exactly the same that the Gukurahundi did. They went to villages and raped children, raped mothers, raped grandmothers in front of their fathers, their brothers, their cousins, their uncles. They forced people to rape their daughters. It was part of a genocidal sexual rape strategy. So there is no doubt, Uguti, and there is sufficient documented evidence of the Gukurahundi perpetrators causing serious bodily and mental harm to their victims. In almost every documented case, victims report that they were severely beaten, they were tortured over long periods, and that they suffered extreme physical and mental pain and harm. Apart from beatings, civilians would be burnt, and civilians would undergo mental torture. They would be forced to rape each other. They would even be forced to beat and kill each other. There are many instances of the Gukurahundi causing serious bodily and mental harm as envisaged by the Genocide Convention. The last one is, not the last one, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction. I mean, who doesn't know what the Gukurahundi did? Even the curfew and blocking food aid, thousands of people died of hunger, just hunger. They intended, all the acts that they did were calculated to bring about the destruction of the Ndebeles in Matabele land. Even if they don't necessarily lead to the complete destruction, it is sufficient that the conditions that are inflicted are designed and calculated to bring about the death. There are so many examples which are supported by case law from Rwanda, from Yugoslavia, and other tribunals. If you think about it, looking at just a number of examples, if I may point them out, the systematic policy and practice of burning down entire villages and homesteads throughout Matabeleland and Midlands, including the villages of Salankomo, Nxuma, Mbiria, Koroziba, Bumbu, Mkonyeni, Sandawana, they all demonstrate a plan to bring about conditions aimed at destroying the Ndebele group. The intention is to bring about your destruction. If you look at the burning of food stocks belonging to villagers, drought, burning is pala, because they were trying to stop people from feeding dissidents, apparently. It was also calculated to destroy the villagers. If you think of the prolonged curfew and the food embargo imposed by the government and enforced by the Gukurahundi perpetrators in Matabele during one of the worst droughts in the history of Zimbabwe, it was all calculated to destroy. And starve the people of Matabele, and it in fact did starve thousands of Ndebeles. Hazel Cameron has written about this, the starvation. And finally, the prolonged hardships that people were subjected to, beatings, refusal to secure medical care for Ndebele. Uchawe kutwelinga esibhedlela uzufe khonapho iza inyawo zibole, ungephuka unyawo kwakuze kubole. I even know a story of one of the survivors, Oweswale, bamdubule esandleni, wagcine unyawo isandla sakhe bese amputated. Wahlala endlini sasabuka esibhedlela. So you think about all these things. Many of the victims would die from their injuries because they were told not to go and seek medical treatment. The inhumane conditions, the beatings, the torture imposed on detainees at Palakwe and other detention camps, stops camp, and talking about Kwanda. There was this camp in Kwanda, I forget the name. Not Stacey. Anyway, those who are from Kwanda know it. I forget the name, but I know the name. So there are clear parallels between these things, including between Palakwe and the camps by the Nazis. The last enumerated act is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. On the face of it, one might not see that. Are there measures that they put in place? Did Gukurahundi put in place measures to stop the procreation in Matabele land? When one looks very carefully at what constitutes these measures, what are the different things, that the range of actions that can be calculated to stop a group from procreating, to prevent births within a group. This includes forced sterilization, sexual mutilation, forced birth control, forced separation of the sexes, forced impregnation by a member or another. And these acts have been held in cases before the tribunals as constituting actions to prevent births. If you look at Gukurahundi, if you apply this requirement, there are several examples. The widespread and systematic rapes of civilians and the accompanying physical and mental harm, the targeting of women, the deliberate. I was talking to a colleague, I'm not going to name the colleague, the other day, sitting with me, Sipo, comrade that we've worked on for years on this. I said, Mina, I've come to the conclusion that every girl above 10 years would arguably have been raped at that time by the Gukurahundi, which is scary because you start to think, well, what does that mean? We know, of course, they raped the entire school, about between 30 and 50 girls who were aged between 14 and the oldest being 16. We know that. So it means, why would they stop at 14? They would. So my colleague was saying, I believe if every child above 10, I mean, we've worked closely together. I don't want to go into details about that. But the point is this, that the widespread and systematic rapes and the accompanying physical and mental harm demonstrates a plan to destroy the will and the capacities of the Ndebele to procreate. That's why baberepa abantwana phambi kwaboyise, beforce oyise ukuthi berepa abantwana. It was designed to kill completely the spirit of Ndebele people to ever have children, to procreate. And the fact that they would mutilate Epalakwe, there's instances especially of the CIO using knives, mutilating, placing objects in the genitals of women. It tells you clearly. And the fact that, for example, they would stab and completely disembowel pregnant women. It tells you this clearly is indicative of a deliberate plan. The mass rape of women, the deliberate beating of pregnant women on their stomachs, the targeting ukuthi nxa uchaya uphethe umntwana we-dissident uzithwele ngumntwana bekushaya isisu, the burning and killing of infants and children, ukuchaya abantwana bechayelela phezu kwezihlahla, the electrocution of men on the genitals, the beating and crushing of genitals of male victims during torture, the mutilation of the private parts of women using bayonets and sharp objects, even following rapes, demonstrates a clear plan to prevent future births. These people were never supposed to have children afterwards. The rounding up of and abduction of women from villages, keeping them overnight at camps where they would be gang raped. It was all aimed at breaking the spirit of the women and the families, destroying familial and marital relationships and breaking up families, which it did. That's why unkomo at the end of Gukurahundi labo baba babhoda emathebeleni yonke bencenga abantu ukuthi kwakuyimpi yemukelana onkosikazi benu liyakwazi ukuthi okwenzakeleyo kwenzakele. And abaningi onkosikazi would never say ukuthi bayenzweni sebebuyele ekhaya. Babesithi sichayiwe kuphela. Many of the cases of women, they say basichayile basithethe ubusuku bahamba lathi enkambeni ukuthi siye baphekela basichaye ubusuku bonke. Ukuchaywa lokhana yikurechwa ubusuku bonke. So all these acts forcing family members to sleep with each other were all aimed at breaking the spirit of Ndebeles and preventing them from having children and procreating. And ngizama lapho on the question of the Enumerated Acts, and then sesiya ku conclusion. So sengizamile ukuthi ngiyelule ukuthi genocide yini, ama elements ayo ayiwapi, bese ngizekelisa ngeconduct la ngezenzo zeGukurahundi, ngitshengisela ukuthi izenzo zeGukurahundi zilingana okungakanani lama requirements awe genocide asemthethweni. Ngizaphetha ngokuthi once a crime is determined to be an international crime, or a crime is determined to be genocide, according to international law, there is an obligation for that crime, if it is genocide, to be investigated, to be prosecuted, and to be punished. You will have seen a case in South Africa, bathathi Israel bayisa ICJ, besithi i-committee genocide, becela ICJ ukuthi ifake isinqumo sokuthi ime lokho ekwenzayo. Ngoba under international law, there is a legal obligation to prevent and punish genocide by whoever has committed it and wherever it is committed. Every country has an obligation, and especially from the Genocide Act, which Zimbabwe is a party to. It became a party to Genocide Act in 1982, I think, 81, 82. South Africa is a party to Genocide Act as well, so is Israel and the others. So the Genocide Act calls on creates an obligation on all parties to the act to prevent genocide, but also to punish it. I will try quickly to answer the question. So why has nothing been done vis-a-vis Gukurahundi genocide? So the first thing is this. There are certain places where the case could have been taken. The ICJ would have been a case if a state had taken the case to the ICJ at the time. But we also know the time when this happened. It was Cold War. There was a fear ZAPU was aligned to the Soviets. The Americans, the British, they all quietly watched as Mugabe was butchering ZAPU and Ndebele supporters. So at that time, this was the same time when in Latin America, in Argentina, in Chile, there were similar violations. So there are political existential dynamics around it, bringing justice at the time. At the time, it was not done. At the time, nobody felt they wanted to do it. It was also during the Cold War. The question then comes, can it be done now? The answer is absolutely yes. Genocide as a crime, genocide, any international crime has no statute of limitations. And in Zimbabwe, only one crime does not prescribe, which is murder. All other crimes are after 20 years. So if you commit a crime and nothing is done for 20 years, that crime prescribes, prescription. But only murder does not prescribe. But an international crime does not prescribe. So you can commit genocide 30 years later, 40 years later, you're still liable. So the question then is simply to continue to call for the international community to hold the perpetrators, to investigate, prosecute and punish, because icala le genocide aliboli. Ngizacela ukuqondisa kancane, bengithe Genocide Act, bengifisa ukuthi ngithi Genocide Convention. Lapho bengithe Genocide Act, bengihlose ukuthi i-Genocide Convention. iZimbabwe ilayo futhi i-Genocide Act eyayiphasa ngo-2016. Angazi babecabangeni, bazama ukuthi bevikavike kiyo, but abakuzamayo ukuthi bekwenza ukuthi bezishilde akuvumakali emthethweni. iZimbabwe ila i-Genocide Act, and i-Genocide Act liyane khona eZimbabwe i-avenue accountability. Okuhluphayo of course ukuthi siyakwazi ukubusa abantu kwakathesi. Nzama lapho, ngiyabonga.